Ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
The cantor and I made an executive decision just before services, and that is we've reached the time of the year where it makes a little more sense to light Shabbat candles at the end of services rather than at the beginning. Now, when it's a few months before now and it's dark out at 4:30, then there's no question about it. We're just at that point. I think it's just going to be going down when we finish. That's my prediction. Please join us. We're going to be singing Yedid Nefesh, which is on page 128.
Please join me. Yedid Nefesh, Av HaRachaman, Av HaRachaman, Meshoch Avdecha, El Retzonecha, El Retzonecha, Yedid Nefesh, Av HaRachaman, Av HaRachaman, Meshoch Avdecha, El Retzonecha, El Retzonecha, Yarutz Avdecha, Kemo Ayal, Yishtachave El Muladarecha, Yedid Nefesh, Av HaRachaman, Av HaRachaman, Meshoch Avdecha, El Retzonecha, El Retzonecha.
On page 138, we've reached the moment for Lecha Dodi. As we customarily do, we'll be singing the first, second, fifth, and ninth stanzas. And when we reach the ninth stanza, if you're comfortable doing so, please join us in rising and facing the door so we can symbolically welcome the spirit of Shabbat.
לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. שמור וזכור בדיבור אחד, השמיענו אל המיוחד. אדוני אחד ושמו אחד, לשם ולתפארת ולתהילה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לקראת שבת לכו ונלכה, כי מקור הברכה מראש מקדם נסוכה. סוף מעשה במחשבה תחילה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. התעוררי, התעוררי, כי באורך קומי אורי, 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 שיר דברי. כבוד אדוני עלייך נגלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. בואי ושלום עטרת בעלה, גם בשמחה ובצולה, תוך אמוני ים סגולה. בואי חלה, בואי חלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה.
Please remain standing as we turn to page 144 and join together with the cantor as he leads us through the Reader's Kaddish into the main body of the service.
יתגדל ויקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומייכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל. בקלה בקלה ובזמן קריב אמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעלם ולעלמי היה. יתברך יתברך וישתבח ויפאר ותרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה ברכו לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה. תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן מעלמא ואמרו אמן. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Yai la 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 la. Baruchu et Adonai HaMevorach. 'Baruch המבורך, המבורך, לעולם ועד.
And let's continue together with a prayer for thanking God for the wonder of nature. You can find a poetic translation of it on page 149, and please join me at the top of the page. Praise to you, Adonai our God, from whom the evening flows. Your wisdom sets the way on which time and season glide. Your breath guides the sail of the stars. Creator of the tide of time and light, you guide the current of day into night. As heaven spans to infinity, you set its course for eternity. Praise to you, Adonai our God, from whom the evening flows. Baruch atah Adonai, ha'ma'ariv aravim. Page 150. Ahavat olam Beit Yisrael, Amecha ahavta, Amecha ahavta, Torah u'mitzvot, Chukim u'mishpatim, Otanu limadeta, Otanu limadeta. Al kein Adonai Eloheinu b'shochveinu u'v'komeinu nasiach bechukecha v'nismach b'divrei toratecha u'v'mitzvotecha le'olam va'ed ki hem chayenu ve'orech yameinu uvahem nege yomam v'layla, nege yomam v'layla, ve'ahavatecha al tasir mimenu le'olamim. Baruch atah Adonai, ohev amo Yisrael, ohev amo Yisrael. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai echad. Baruch Shem kevod malchuto le'olam va'ed. Please be seated. And let's continue with the Ve'ahavta on page 154.
Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol me'odecha ve'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha ושיננתם לבניך, ודיברת בם, בשבתך בביתך, ובלכתך בדרך, ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. Ani Adonai Elohechem, Adonai Elohechem, Emet.
Let's continue together at the top of 157. Standing on the parted shores of history,
we still believe what we were taught before ever we stood at Sinai's foot, that wherever we go, it is eternally Egypt, that there is a better place, a promised land, that the winding way to that promise passes through the wilderness, that there is no way to get from here to there except by joining hands, marching together. Mi chamocha bailim Adonai, mi kamocha nedar bakodesh, nora tehilot osef ele, nora tehilot osef ele, malechutecha ra'u vanecha, bokei ayam lifnei Moshe uMiriam, Zeili, Zeili, anu ve'ameru, Adonai imloch leolam va'ed, Adonai imloch leolam va'ed, Adonai imloch leolam va'ed. V'ne'emar kifar Adonai et Yaakov, ugalo miyad chazak mimenu, Baruch atah Adonai, Ga'al Yisrael.
Let's continue with the Hashkivenu in the middle of page 160. Grant, O God, that we lie
Down in peace, and raise us up, our guardian, to life renewed. Spread over us the shelter of your peace. Guide us with your good counsel. For your name's sake, be our help. Shield and shelter us beneath the shadow of your wings. Defend us against enemies, illness, war, famine, and sorrow. Distance us from wrongdoing. For you, God, watch over us and deliver us. For you, God, are gracious and merciful. Guard our going and coming to life and to peace evermore. Blessed are you, Adonai, guardian of Israel, whose shelter of peace is spread over us, over all your people Israel, and over Jerusalem. Baruch atah Adonai, hapores sukat shalom, aleinu v'al kol amo Yisrael, ve'al Yerushalayim.
Page 162.
V'shameru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם לעולם. ביני ובין בני ישראל אותי לעולם לעולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, וביום השביעי, וביום השביעי שבת שבת וינפש, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם, לדורותם ברית עולם, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם, לדורותם ברית עולם.
On page 164, we rise and join together in the Amidah.
Adonai sefatai tiftach ufi yagid tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips, that my mouth may declare your praise. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei avoteinu ve'imoteinu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, ve'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, ve'Elohei Leah, Ha'el Hagadol, Hagibor v'Hanora, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, וקונה הכל, וזוכר חסדי אבות ואימהות, ומביא גאולה לבני בניהם, למען שמו באהבה. מלך עוזר ומושיע ומגן, ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן אברהם ועזרת שרה. אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי הכל אתה רב להושיע, משיב הרוח ומוריד הגשם, מכלכל חיים בחסד, מחיי הכל ברחמים רבים, סומך נופלים ורופא חולים, ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר. מי כמוך בעל גבורות ומיתו מלך, מלך ממית ומחיה ומצמיח ישועה, ונאמן אתה להחיות הכל. ברוך אתה אדוני מחיי הכל. אתה קדוש ושמך קדוש, וקדושים בכל יום יהללוך סלע. ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש.
Please be seated. And let's continue together at the top of page 173. We'll continue on at the top of the odd number pages until we get to page 178, where we will join together in praying Shalom Rav. Together, may these hours of rest and renewal open our hearts to joy and our minds to truth. May all who struggle find rest on this day. May all who suffer find solace.
May all who hurt find healing on this day. May all who despair find purpose. May all who hunger find fulfillment on this day. And may this day fulfill its promise. Baruch atah Adonai, Mekadesh HaShabbat.
Ever-present one,
May we, your people Israel, be worthy in our deeds and our prayers. Wherever we live, wherever we seek you, in this land, in Zion restored, in all lands, you are our God, whom alone we serve in reverence. Baruch atah Adonai, she'otcha levadcha b'yirah na'avod.
God of goodness,
We give thanks for the gift of life, wonder beyond words, for the awareness of soul, our light within, for the world around us so filled with beauty, for the richness of the earth which day by day sustains us. For all these and more we offer thanks. Baruch atah Adonai, hatov shimcha ulecha na'eh lehodot. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. Ki ata hu melech adon lechol hashalom. Atahu melech adon lechol hashalom. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. וטוב בעיניך לברך את עמך ישראל בכל עת ובכל שעה בשלומך. שלום רב על ישראל עמך תשים לעולם. שלום רב על ישראל עמך תשים לעולם. תשים לעולם. תשים לעולם. Blessed are you, Adonai, who blesses your people Israel and all people with peace. Baruch atah Adonai, hamvarech et amo Yisrael b'shalom. And we'll take just a few moments for our own private prayer and reflection. Yihyu l'ratzon imrefi. Yihyu l'ratzon imrefi. V'egyon libi lefanecha. Adonai tzuri v'goali. Oh, may the words of my mouth, the meditations of my heart be acceptable before you. O God, my rock and my redeemer. Oseh shalom b'meromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru, ve'imru. Amen.
We've reached the moment in our service. Oh, there it is. For the Misha Beirach for healing, customarily said on Shabbat morning after the reading of Torah, but in many liberal congregations also done in the evening on Friday, Kabbalat Shabbat. We think especially this Shabbat of Bill Ross, Katie Peltz Davis, Alan Turner, Bob Ransom, Patrice R., Michelle Jacoby, Catherine Lamb, Bob Ratke, Maccabee Ben Avraham, Kathleen Manchero, Al Myers, Jack Marvin, Donald Metzke, Cindy Kramer, Jim Stillman, Janelle C., Ruth Lowenstein, Natalie Winowich, Carolyn Berman, Leonore Friedman, Tracy Weiser, Michelle Reese, Marcia Reese, Jean and Paul Wilhelm, Lisa Frolkis, Bill Reed, Sarah Friedman, Leo Weinschall, David Goldenholtz, Leah Nachamat Bat Faya, Sarah Bat Bessie Veben, Rivka Fagi Bat Phyllis, Jennifer Houston, Feivel Ben Rachalea, David Werner, Linda Roberts Greenblatt, Neil Pinsky, Lular Hughes, Jean Redmond, Dietem Eater, Barbara Blick, Herb Selden, Michael Ross, Michael and Kathy Keeley, Jen Volker, Debbie Geeden, Marilyn and Michael Stillman, William Frankie, Joseph Marcus, Carol Willems, Mike Johnson, Doug Lewis, Susie Garrison, Deidre Tischberg, Rivka Bracha Bat Basha Pesha, Karen Horwitz, Bill Nicode, Rich Nybor, Bracha Bat Miriam, Charles Young, Avram Ben Baris, Truth Sophia Freeman, Marlene Levy, Zisa Elka Bakasia, Bob Neubauer, Carol Para, Madeline Para, Jimmy Ansfield, Martha Ross, Kim McNeil, and Yosef Ben Lily Vinatan, and would add Sam Sugarman as well. And if there are others of whom you're aware who could use our prayers for healing, I would ask you, please, as we turn to page 371 for a modern setting for the prayer, please hold them close to in your heart as together we pray.
Mekor habracha leimotenu. May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Shebeirach imotenu mekor habracha lavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shelema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen.
Last week, I shared the first 7 days of my recent trip to Israel, days that were caught up with the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis Convention in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and also some interesting political things happening in Israel itself right now. And the last, I promised this week, because I couldn't really include it last week, I didn't have time, to talk about the last 3 days of my sojourn, which were spent in the West Bank among Palestinian families. My purpose for being there with a group of 6 other rabbis was to really kind of come face to face with what I'll call the Palestinian narrative, the stories they tell of what has happened in the region over the past 100 years in the Middle East. As you might imagine, the Palestinian narrative is nothing like the Israeli narrative. My goal, as someone steeped in the Zionist narrative my entire life, and who has an undying love and commitment to the Jewish state, is simply this. I want to be able to hold both narratives, Israeli and Palestinian, together at the same time. I'm working on that challenge. It is not an easy thing to do, but it reminds me very much of the current moment in America, in which we too are trying to reconcile both the traditional narrative, which I sometimes refer to as the I did not chop down the cherry tree version of George Washington and America's origins, along with a newer narrative that doesn't elide the racism and discrimination that have been part of American life and expansionism from the very beginning. It's challenging to hold 2 dovetailing narratives, which in many respects contradict and are the mirror image of the other. Growing up, one of the first Zionist slogans I learned was this: a people without a land for a land without a people. 2 interesting things. First of all, I learned recently that quote came not from a Jewish person at all, but rather from a mid-19th century Christian clergyman. I'm not sure in what context, but no matter, it still works in this context. And secondly, it's patently untrue. There is and was a people living in the land, in addition to Jews, Arabs, who had become known over time as Palestinians. As they say on television, this is their story. During the 3 days, we met a variety of people: bookstore owners, farmers, academics, bed and breakfast owners, with whom we stayed in a small town called Jifna near Ramallah, families who live in caves in the southern Hebron Hills, and an Israeli soldier who belongs to a group called Breaking the Silence, which opposes the army's actions in the occupied territories. I want to share a few stories from the trip. I actually have a bunch of photographs, and I was thinking, gosh, this would be good to do online sometime. The alternative is we're looking for a Sunday morning where I might be able to share the details of the trip with a little bit of illustration, which I think would help. One of the first places we visited is called the City of David. It is a spit of land surrounded by valleys on 2 sides, and it sits just literally adjacent to south of the old city of Jerusalem, just down that hill. This is where Jerusalem began more than 3,000 years ago. There was everything where the old city is today, and the Dome of the Rock, and where the temple stood, and the new city. All of that was not around or developed whatsoever. It was just that little spit of land, the City of David. It has, over time, it became known as Silwan, which is a rather larger town that sits to its east, but this was a major part of it. And I was sort of surprised to find out that over the last number of years, that whole area, the city of David, has become one large archaeological dig and has been enshrined as such. It's still an active archaeological site. Its presence and purpose is largely political. After all, both Israelis and Palestinians hold fast to their history in the land, and this site, called the City of David after King David, might hold some tantalizing shards of history. There are very few homes left in what was Silwan and is now the City of David, and the ones that are there belong to Jews. The rest of the area is archaeological excavations separated by modern walkways and a roof, I suppose, to keep off the rain in the winter and the sun the rest of the time. One area we were shown was purportedly part of King David's residence, his palace, which, if I could describe how far a leap that is historically. However, accuracy, we learned, is really not the point of these excavations. The point is being able to say, we are investigating whether this area is part of King David's palace, which to some people's ears is the Jewish equivalent of saying we found proof that this was the Jewish capital 3,000 years ago, which is precisely the point. We spent a day in Bethlehem as well, a place I visited but not very frequently when I lived there. Although I used to love to stay up Christmas Eve. They would, on Israeli TV, show the midnight mass from Bethlehem, and I thought that was very cool. But the idea of actually going there was not. In Bethlehem, on one side, the city is surrounded by the 25-foot-tall security wall, which funnels traffic into a checkpoint where one can cross into Israel, that is, if one is an Israeli Arab or a Jew. Palestinian Arabs living in the West Bank need special permission and papers. The wall was erected after in the early aughts, when suicide bombers were crossing the unmarked border between Israel and the West Bank and murdering as many people as they could find. I was there in the spring of 2002, and there was something in Jerusalem blowing up every day. Saturday night, a really big cafe was blown up. Once the wall and the fence went up, suicide bombings dropped to practically zero. It's an essential part of keeping Israelis safe from terror. However, for the Palestinians, the vast majority of whom are not terrorists, the wall and checkpoints completely prevent freedom of their movement. Someone who lives in Ramallah and works in Bethlehem has to cross checkpoints to get there. What should be a 40-minute drive takes at least multiple hours. In addition to the permanent crossing stations, the Army occasionally sets up temporary barriers known as flying checkpoints, which may appear on any road in the West Bank and end up adding another hour or two to your journey. Near the entrance to Bethlehem, standing in the shadow of this 25-foot-tall wall, is a small hotel called, I kid you not, the Waldorf Hotel. I thought it was funny. The Waldorf. It's famous mostly not just for that corny name, but because the mysterious artist known as Banksy has worked his magic on the hotel rooms there and some public spaces as well in the building. There is art actually all over the place, not art done by professionals, but people who have been painting these walls to turn them into something other than just plain concrete. One wall I saw contains a list of all the children killed during the occupation in Bethlehem and their ages. Being able to read Arabic was not an advantage at that point because it was really disturbing. Another section of the wall is emblazoned with the drawing of a man who I looked at and I said, my God, I think that's George Habash. George Habash was a Christian leader of the most violent Palestinian terrorist group, the Marxist-Leninist PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who brought you the blowing up of planes on the tarmac in 1970 in Jordan, as well as attacks on Israeli diplomats in Europe. A third nearby wall has a map of Palestine. It's a map that is the shape of Palestine with the Palestinian flag filling the shape, but one look at it and you see it is Palestine from the river to the sea. It's a maximalist view of Palestine, not a West Bank view. And there is another one that says, we will return, and a list of, actually this is around the same thing, around that map. And at the top it says, we will return, and there's a list in English of all of the villages and towns from which people had come into the refugee camp inside of Bethlehem, which is called Aida. As we left the refugee camp, which actually looks just like the rest of Bethlehem, I think of refugee camps as people staying out in tents and bearing the, well, that was true for the first 3 years, but after that, people realized this is not ending so soon, and so they started building buildings. The difference, though, is that when you're in a refugee camp, all of the passageways are very narrow, and there's no public space. And people are sort of living on top of each other, and our tour guide was very diplomatic about saying, you knew exactly what your neighbors are up to all the time, because it's just people living in great, great proximity. When we left the camp, we turned right, and we saw suspended, not really suspended, on 2 pillars about 30 feet up in the air, a 25-foot-long key, like an old-fashioned key, not one that you'd see today. And that key is a reminder of the many Palestinians who still have keys from the homes they fled in 1948 during Israel's War of Independence, or as Palestinians refer to it, the Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic. A last anecdote. We visited a place where I had never been before, which I wanted to see, the South Hebron Hills. Hebron, or Hebron as it is in English, is a holy city for Jews. It's where Abraham bought a cave to bury his wife Sarah, and where numbers of the matriarchs and patriarchs are also buried. There was always historically a robust Jewish community in the neighborhood until they were massacred by their neighbors in 1929. When the West Bank became part of Israel after the Six-Day War, Orthodox Jews wanted to go to Hebron. Some of these, as I've described before, Orthodox Jews were caught up in a messianic fervor. Look, we just won that war in 6 days. This must be a message that we should go out and inhabit the rest of the land of Israel. There, they founded a small enclave in the city of Hebron, whose security today requires thousands of soldiers for just several hundred people, and the emptying out of what is called a sterile zone for several blocks past where those folks are living. Outside of Hebron is the newly built, it's not new anymore, but was one of the first settlements built on the site of the biblical Kiryat Arba, one of the first post-Six-Day War settlements. Our first stop was an open-air, nicely manicured, open area surrounded by large stones and trees. There was an engraved pillar, kind of almost looked like a headstone standing up, that announced that this was the Meir Kahane Park, named after Rabbi Meir Kahane, who had been quite an activist in the United States, founding the Jewish Defense League back in the 60s and a number of other things, who moved, I think in the 1980s, beginning of the 80s, moved to Israel and transferred all of his energy into hating Palestinians. And seeing that took my breath away. walking past that sign at the entrance, you find that there's an open kind of circle area that's paved with a grave in the middle. And as many graves are in Israel, the headstone is not vertical but horizontal and sort of lying on top of the grave. So I looked at that and really flinched. It said, "Here lies Baruch Goldstein." I immediately got very nauseous. Baruch Goldstein was the ultra-Orthodox resident of Kiryat Arba, who on Purim in 1994 entered the cave of the Machpelah, that cave in Hebron where it's holy to Jews, and also to an extent to Muslims as well. And he opened fire on 100 men who were there praying, killing scores of them and wounding even more. He was subdued and beaten to death. His comrades in the ultra-Orthodox settler world celebrated his act and said, you know, it's so appropriate to have something like that happen on Purim, the holiday in which we get to destroy our enemies, which if you read the last chapters that we never read of the book of Esther, actually has a bit of a revenge fantasy in there. This was very, very, very real, however. Goldstein was a medical doctor who, it turns out, had a very good friend of his who had been killed by terrorists a couple of days before, which may have been in a sense, a proximate cause or a precipitating action, but of course there's no excuse for what he did. And people who celebrate what he did, in my mind, are just despicable. The rest of the headstone said this: "Here lies the holy Baruch Goldstein. He gave his life for the people of Israel, its Torah, and its land." And then it quotes from Psalm 24, something that the cantor and I often say at burials. "He had clean hands and a pure heart." And it then concludes saying, "May God avenge his blood." And I stood there just kind of going, I do not understand the world these people are living in. I don't understand the messianic fervor of their actions. I don't understand how they could celebrate something that is truly one of the most heinous acts ever done, even on Purim, for that matter. By the way, Goldstein was tried in an Israeli criminal court and is spending the rest of his days in prison. You see, Jews who live in the West Bank are under Israeli law, civil and criminal. Palestinians, in contrast, are under military law and administration. Now, it turns out this is how occupations customarily occur, but most occupations don't last 70 some odd years. When two people living in the same place are subjected to two different legal systems, that's called apartheid. I don't think Israel is anything like South Africa was under that version of apartheid, but I kind of shook when I realized, you know, when people use that term on a certain legal level, it's entirely accurate. From Israeli soldiers who speak out against the occupation, we learned that the practices in the West Bank focus on intimidating the population in order to keep things quiet. One such practice I learned, I actually heard about this some years ago in the West Bank, is in Hebrew called almanat kash, which means straw, like the hay, straw, widow. It involves arbitrary nighttime house invasions during which residents are crowded into one room while the army takes up residence in the other rooms and on the roof. And after 9 hours, the soldiers leave and life in the building resumes. Beyond the intimidation factor, however, there is another purpose an officer shared with us. There are times, this officer said, when we have to occupy a home under hostile conditions. We use this as an opportunity to practice the maneuver in a place where there isn't a risk of an armed response. Rational. Is it right? I'm not so sure. This week, for the first time, you may have heard yesterday, more Americans are sympathetic with Palestinians than they are with Israelis. And that's the first time that has happened. I have no doubt it has to do with the nature of the current government, with people like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, two members of the cabinet whose racism is plain to see. Ben-Gvir even has in his office a large framed photograph of Baruch Goldstein, who murdered so many Palestinians in Hebron. Such poll surprises or results would not be a surprise for younger Jews, unconstrained by communal affiliations that would smother their questions. Questions like, why are we involved in supporting a Jewish state that doesn't even follow Jewish values? Our responses of, well, it's complicated, or, we don't live there or serve in the army, so we can't voice an opinion, are missing the point. Yes, it is complicated, to be sure, but so is every social justice issue in our world. The fact is, younger Jews get this directly, and they view our silence as complicity. So then, what am I to do with the Palestinian narrative, so different than the narrative I've carried throughout my life? Well, as I mentioned, a first step is to try to hold on to both narratives at the same time, because both are in many ways true. Embracing that dissonance, holding that complexity, is challenging. As my dear friend Rabbi David Stern reminds us, embracing both of the competing narratives is just the first step. Ultimately, such engagement, while initially disorienting, will eventually lead us to greater clarity, and with greater clarity, toward deeper and more effective action. And the alternative is really no alternative at all. As Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel once wrote, few are guilty, but all are responsible. If this is so, and we do know what is happening, then we must accept responsibility even if we ourselves are not guilty. Otherwise, the Talmud teaches that when we see that a harm has been done, we must pray that the rest of the sermon got printed. Hasn't happened in 33 years. Let me see what I was thinking of at the end. Basically, it's our job to have a conversation and to try to embrace these two sets of truths. We all have an investment in the health of Israel, not just as another Jewish community around the world for whom we should have some degree of responsibility, but because we have a vested interest in making sure there is a refuge for Jews who don't have other places to go. I am not one who is saying we're heading towards something horrible here in the United States, but the increase in anti-Semitism that we see right now is a reminder that the world is not always a kind place for Jews, and so to preserve Israel as a place to be is certainly an important thing. And if you ask, I'll mail you the last 2 pages of the sermon. Shabbat Shalom. I was pointing out to the cantor beforehand that I need to change the toner in my printer because it was getting very light. So light that it distracted me from actually counting and making sure all the pages were there. So we're going to conclude services first with the Aleinu, which is on page 586. We'll then have a chance to say Kaddish, and we'll then have an opportunity to hear a few announcements. We'll then have the lighting of the candles, which is now a little late, but I can still see the sun. It's not so bad. As well as the Friday evening Kiddush and the Motzi. So please join us in rising, page 586.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם. ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד.
The mourner's Kaddish is found on page 598. We think especially this Shabbat of Victor Robb, who was just buried on Monday, as well as Dr. Hermes Hoffman, who died during the past month. We also think of the following, who have members of our congregation saying Kaddish for them in this year following the death: Nicholas Winowich, Leanne Borkovitz, Tom St. John, Morty Blutstein, Barbara Wyman, Ralph Marshall Gorin, Edith Lank, Susan Melanie Siegel, Don Polachek, Bev Colton, Brian Spring, Ruthie Zabotsky, Jay Aronoff, Al Rieselbach, Esther Stein Tiny Arnold, Rosemary Bloom, Elmer Gary Martin, James Goodman, Jan Goldberg, Bobby Driggett, Evelyn Garfinkel, Judy Solinsky, Brian Robert Ellis, Janet Joyce Meister, Rosalie Kahn, Harry Wallace, Ted Roth, Don Styler, and Elsie Kanan. And we remember those whose yahrzeit fall this week: Ben Alberts, Esther Ansfield, Sylvia Berkowitz, George Copland, Lisa Lottie Freeman, Leon Glassman, Marvin Goldberg, Joan Goldenstein, Judith Heldman, Leona Virginia Hill, Maddie Katz, Helen Koppel, Ben Lerner, Emmett Peck, Rose Pearlstein Pincus, Harold Reif, Doji Sherman, Jerry Siegel, Harvey Simon, Roman Wagner, Erwin Worth, Morris Wiviat, and Nate Ziskin. If there's anyone here who is mourning the recent passing of a friend or loved one, or observing the yahrzeit of a loved one's death whose name I didn't mention, I would ask you please to share the names aloud with us. We continue with Kaddish.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה.
Amen.
בעלמא דברה חירותה וימליך מלכותה. בחיי חון וביומי חון, ובחיי דכל בית ישראל. בעגלה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם ולעלמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח, ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא. ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום, עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן.
May the source of peace, who makes peace in the highest heavens, enable us to learn how to make peace here on earth. And may God bless those in mourning with a measure of consolation and comfort. And together we say,
Amen.
Please be seated, except for you.
Thank you. Tonight's Oneg is sponsored by Nick and Janet Padway.
in memory of Marvin Goldberg. We are grateful for the contributions made this week to our Sinai community in memory of Roman Wagner, Jerry Siegel, Tom St. John, Victor Robb, Helen Koppel, Erwin Worth, Dr. Hermes Hoffman, and Doris Doji Sherman. And in honor or appreciation of Rabbi Cohn, Cantor Newman, and Josh Parks. So join us for the following upcoming programs. Rabbi Cohn for Shabbat V'Nafash tomorrow at 10:30 in the Worship and Learning Space for a special Shabbat morning prayer drawing from mindfulness practices such as meditation. The Sinai Brotherhood presents me, Dr. Lily Gorin, who will discuss my new book, The Politics of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, at 10 a.m. in the Worship and Learning Space, coffee and bagels for all. And I believe that Boswell Books still has a couple copies. If you want to get one, I'm happy to sign them on Sunday. Congregation Sinai competes in Who Knows One. Watch our team, Rabbi Cohn, Michelle Silverman, and Brad Dallett, in the quarterfinals on Monday, March 20th at 7 p.m., and Wednesday, March 22nd at 7 p.m., semi and finals if our team moves forward. See the e-news for the Facebook Live link. Sages, seniors aging gracefully and engaged at Sinai, join us for part 3, Shomer Hagof, Taking Care of Your Body and Mind, March 23rd from 1 to 2:15 via Zoom. Newcomers RSVP to Jen via the e-news. Please refer to the Tuesday and Friday Sinai e-news for the latest Sinai programming information. Shabbat Shalom.
You do? Have you written a book? Okay, you can still make an announcement, please.
On Tuesday, the Federation has Jewry. It's 2 guys. The rappers, one is Palestinian and one is Israeli, and they are performing at Artist Pitch at 7 p.m. But you do have to contact Maria Roth to get an admission. It's free. But they're very interesting. We can talk to you later about that. And then on April 1st, we've been invited to celebrate the Qatar.
They still need to be blessed.
Celebrating Ramadan at our friends at the Turkish American Society. It is probably about 7 p.m. It's at sunset, and there's a sign up to my email address on the emails.
Very good. I was so focused on what you were saying, Bobby, that I went ahead and lit the candles. So, but they have not yet been blessed, so please rise.
Amen.
And on page 123 in the Siddur, you can find the words for the Friday evening Kiddush.
Please join me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu, v'shabbat kodsho b'yahava uvratzon hinchilanu, zikaron lema'aseh v'reishit, ki hu yom techila l'mikrei kodesh, zecher litziat Mitzrayim. Kivanu v'acharta, ve'otanu kidashta, mikol ha'amim, ve'shabbat kodshecha, be'ahava u'v'ratzon, hinchaltanu, baruch atah Adonai, mekadesh ha'shabbat l'chaim.
And before we say the motzi, let me ask you that as you make your way inside for the oneg, please find somebody you don't know here tonight and introduce yourself to them. We imagine that we would like to be, and I think we are most days, a warm and welcoming place, but that is a muscle that has to be exercised with some frequency. So please help us do so. And join us in the motzi.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz b'tei avon.
It's a Jillian. Shabbat shalom, everybody. We'll see you
Shabbat
inside.
shalom.
Well, yeah, well, once I edit it a tiny bit, but yeah, sure. Yeah, that'd be great. Send to your kids. Yeah.